There's something fascinating about tree houses. For many children, they're more than just wooden structures. They're portals to another world, a sanctuary where secrets can be kept and imaginations can run wild. Whether in a suburban backyard or a secluded forest, a treehouse represents freedom and adventure. But what if this place, so idealized for its innocence, turned into a scene of pure terror? The story I'm going to tell you today is true. It takes us to a small neighborhood where a seemingly ordinary treehouse became the epicenter of something so terrifying that its events continue to haunt those who lived near it. Prepare to learn a dark secret hidden among the tall branches and dancing leaves. A story that begins with children's laughter and ends in unsettling silence. Imagine a sunny afternoon, when children are playing outside and the sounds of laughter echo through the streets. That's how it all begins. The treehouse was lovingly built by the parents of a boy named Lucas, who was just 9 years old at the time. Located in a forest behind their house, it was made of rustic but sturdy wood. Small decorations hung from the windows and a rope ladder led up to the entrance. For Lucas and his friends, this place was a perfect refuge, where they could create their own adventures away from the watchful eyes of adults. But there was something about that tree that not even the most creative of kids could imagine. Some people in the neighborhood used to say that the forest had stories. Nothing very concrete, just whispers about strange events in the past. A missing dog here, an unexplained sound there. Small incidents that, in isolation, could be dismissed as coincidences. However, for the older ones, the forest carried a disturbing energy, something they could not explain, but that they felt deep in their hearts. The first days in the treehouse were wonderful. Lucas and his friends would spend hours up there, creating stories and challenging each other to climb even higher into the branches. It was as if that space was theirs, a little universe where they could be whoever they wanted. But the euphoria soon gave way to uneasiness. It all started with small signs: the rope ladder swinging by itself on a windless afternoon, soft footsteps that could be heard on the roof of the house, even when everyone was downstairs. Lucas thought it was just his mental games, but the manifestations became more frequent. The turning point came one clear night, when the group decided to do something they had never tried before: spend the night in the treehouse. Armed with flashlights and blankets, the friends gathered around a small battery-powered lantern, telling scary stories. At first, the night seemed like just another adventure among friends, but the mood changed dramatically as midnight approached. Sounds coming from the woods, the snapping of branches, whispers that seemed to mix with the wind, made the boys begin to question their courage. The initial fear gave way to a feeling of constant observation. Lucas, in particular, felt that something was wrong. His flashlight flickered intermittently, as if something was interfering. When he pointed it to the edge of the tree, he swore he saw a silhouette, something or someone standing still, just watching. When he tried to show it to the others, the figure disappeared, leaving only a silence heavier than the air itself. With his heart racing and a sense of imminent danger, Lucas convinced his friends to climb down and go home. That night, no one slept well, and from that moment on, the treehouse began to be seen in a different light. Something was wrong there, but it was still unclear what. This was just the gateway to a mystery that would unfold in even darker ways. With fear hanging over the group, the story delves deeper into the setting and the details of the people involved. After all, who were Lucas and his friends? And what was in that forest that seemed to pulse with such strange energy? The forest that sheltered the treehouse was unlike any other place in the small town where Lucas lived. Dense and seemingly endless, its trees formed a natural wall that blocked the sun in many spots, creating shadows that moved as the wind blew. The sounds of birds and insects were constant, but there were times when everything was eerily silent, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Those who lived nearby said that the place had a kind of presence, something difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. Lucas was the kind of curious and courageous boy, always ready to explore the unknown. By the age of 9, he already had more adventure stories than many adults he knew. The friends who accompanied him on his journeys were Pedro and Rafael, two neighbors of the same age who shared his enthusiasm for discovery. Pedro was the most logical of the group, always trying to find rational explanations for anything strange, while Rafael, with a fertile imagination, was the one who invented the scariest stories to scare the others. Together, they formed an inseparable trio. The treehouse had become their favorite hangout ever since it was built. Lucas's father, a skilled carpenter, had worked on it for weeks. He used sturdy wood and added details that made it unique: a small porch, windows with makeshift curtains, and even a trapdoor in the floor that led to a secret hiding place. To Lucas, it was a real castle. However, there was something that neither Lucas nor his friends knew about the place. Before it belonged to his family, the land where the forest was located had been owned by a family that had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Only fragments of this story were still mentioned by some older residents, who avoided going into details. Despite this, the children had no reason to suspect that anything could be wrong. What made it all the more strange was the recent behavior of some people in the neighborhood. Mr. Manuel, an elderly man who lived next door, seemed to always be watching the forest with a worried look. He warned Lucas and his friends more than once to be careful. "This place holds stories you don't want to know," he would say, but they would laugh and ignore him. To children, these warnings sounded more like challenges than warnings. As time went on, Lucas began to notice subtle changes in the group's dynamics. Pedro, always confident, seemed more hesitant to return to the treehouse. Rafael, on the other hand, began to invent increasingly frightening stories, as if trying to make sense of what they were experiencing. Lucas, caught between the two extremes, felt that something invisible connected them to the woods, something they couldn't fully understand. One afternoon, while exploring the area around the house, they found something that made everyone's blood run cold. Deep marks at the base of the tree, as if something with huge claws had scratched the wood. Pedro tried to explain how they could just be natural marks, but the tension in the group was palpable. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but everyone felt that something was wrong. These isolated events began to shape the way they viewed the treehouse. The place that was once a refuge now seemed to hold dark secrets, yet something kept drawing them back. Perhaps it was childish curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, something that the woods were determined not to let go. With the setting established and the characters introduced, the first signs that something truly supernatural is happening begin to emerge. The mystery deepens, and the events that follow promise to change the lives of Lucas and his friends forever. It was a colder night than usual. Lucas, Pedro, and Rafael decided, despite their growing doubts, to return to the treehouse. The silence between them as they walked through the woods was unusual. The jokes and conversations that usually filled the path were absent, replaced by furtive glances and hesitant steps. The light from the flashlights cut through the darkness around them, but seemed unable to dispel the oppressive feeling that accumulated as they approached the house. The climb up the rope ladder was slow. Each one seemed to fight against an instinct that told them to go back. When they finally entered the house, the air was denser, as if the space had changed since their last visit. Trying to break the heavy mood, Lucas suggested that they play cards, something that always distracted them. Rafael agreed with a nod, but Pedro seemed absorbed, staring fixedly at the trapdoor in the floor. As they shuffled the cards, a distant sound interrupted the silence. It was a low noise, almost a whisper, but it carried something strange, as if it did not belong in the woods. Rafael was the first to speak. "Did you hear that?" Pedro just nodded, while Lucas tried to ignore the shiver that ran down his spine. "It must be the wind," he said, more to himself than to the others. The card game was abandoned when something even more unsettling happened. The trapdoor lid creaked, moving slowly, as if it were being pushed from within. Everyone stopped and stared, frozen in place. Pedro whispered, "Who opened this?" But no one answered. They knew they hadn't touched the trapdoor. Lucas, trying to gather his courage, shone his flashlight down the hole. At first, all he saw was darkness. The hiding place, which usually held toys and extra flashlights, seemed empty. But then something moved. Two bright spots appeared in the darkness, reflecting the light of the flashlight. They were eyes, staring inhuman, glowing with an intensity that made Lucas feel as if he were being watched by something far beyond his comprehension. Time seemed to stand still. Lucas couldn't look away, while the other two backed away. It was Raphael who broke the silence, shouting in panic. The sound seemed to free Lucas from his trance. He took a step back, almost stumbling, while Pedro grabbed his arm. "Let's get out of here," Pedro shouted, his voice shaking. They climbed down the rope ladder as fast as they could, their feet almost failing as they touched each step. The forest, which had once seemed so familiar, now seemed like a maze of shadows and threatening sounds. When they reached Lucas's backyard, none of them dared to look back. Sitting on the porch, trying to catch their breath, none of the three spoke for several minutes. Raphael finally broke the silence. "What was that? What was in there?" Pedro shook his head, still in shock. Lucas didn't answer. He knew that what they had seen that night was not something that could be easily explained. Now the mystery deepens. Lucas and his friends realize that they cannot ignore what happened and begin to investigate the past of the forest and the treehouse. The danger, however, is far from over, and something seems to be waiting for them to return. The next morning, Lucas, Pedro, and Raphael gathered again, but this time in Lucas's living room. They were exhausted, as if the previous night had drained all their energy. The daylight seemed to make the event in the treehouse less real, almost as if it were a collective dream. But the physical signs were there: the scratches on the floor, the trapdoor that had opened by itself, and most importantly, the fear that persisted on their faces. "We need to find out what's going on," Lucas said, breaking the silence. He wasn't the bravest of the group, but something about what he had seen in that thing's eyes the night before bothered him deeply. Pedro and Raphael agreed, albeit reluctantly. The idea of returning to that place seemed unbearable, but ignoring the situation wasn't an option either. They started by searching the internet, trying to find any stories about the forest or the surrounding area. After hours of searching, Pedro found something interesting. Decades ago, the region had been known for unexplained disappearances, especially of children. The most famous case involved two brothers who disappeared without a trace. Curiously, the story said that the last time they were seen, they were building a treehouse. The detail left the three in shock. Lucas remembered the glowing eyes he had seen in the trapdoor and wondered, with a shiver, if there could be some connection. But they needed more information. It was Raphael who suggested that they speak to Mr. Otavio, an elderly neighbor known for knowing the history of practically everything in the region. When they arrived at Otavio's house, the old man greeted them with a friendly smile, but his expression quickly changed when they mentioned the treehouse. He was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing, as if trying to decide whether or not to talk about it. "You should stay away from that place," he said finally. "There are things that are better left untouched." Despite the warning, Lucas persisted, telling them about the events of the previous night. Mr. Otavio sighed, looking regretful. He explained that long ago, there had been rumors about the woods being a cursed place. Some people believed that something dark lived there, attracting the unwary. And the treehouse? He said it was like a magnet, a gathering point for whatever was there. Pedro, who had remained silent until then, asked with a trembling voice, "And what happens if we go back there?" Ottavio just shook his head. There's no guarantee that you'll come back. The tension in the room was palpable. The boys left their neighbor's house with more questions than answers. However, one thing was clear. The treehouse was connected to something much bigger and much more dangerous than they imagined. Determined to find answers, the group decided to return to the treehouse, armed with flashlights, cameras, and courage. However, when they stepped back into the woods, they realized that darkness awaited them, and it seemed alive. Lucas, Pedro, and Rafael gathered what they could before venturing back into the woods. They brought more powerful flashlights, a camera to record what they saw, and even an old radio they found in Lucas's father's garage. But none of the equipment seemed enough to dispel the fear that hung over them. Still, something kept pushing them forward, a mix of curiosity and the need to understand what they were facing. As they entered the woods, the atmosphere seemed different. Even in the daylight, the place seemed darker, the trees taller, and the silence deeper. Rafael, trying to break the tension, murmured, "Are we doing this out of curiosity or madness?" No one answered. They all knew there was no turning back now. The walk to the treehouse was longer than they remembered, as if the woods were stretching out. When they finally arrived, they noticed something strange. Marks on the ground, like deep scratches, spread in random directions around the base of the house. The marks seemed recent. Pedro was the first to speak. "This wasn't here before, was it?" Rafael shook his head. Lucas, his heart pounding, looked at the camera he was holding. He knew they had to record everything, even if it didn't make sense at the moment. They climbed up one at a time, the rope ladder swaying under their weight. Inside the house, they found the trapdoor exactly as they had left it, open, revealing a black void that seemed deeper than before. Lucas took a deep breath and, flashlight in hand, began to slowly descend through the opening, the other two following hesitantly. Below, they discovered a space that didn't look natural. The walls were made of earth, but they looked molded, as if something had dug there long ago. The air was heavy, and a sense of surveillance hung over the place. Rafael pointed the flashlight to the far corner, where something was glowing faintly. As they got closer, they realized it was a metal object, a small, rusty box. Lucas carefully opened it, revealing old photos of children. Their faces were blurred, but it was possible to see that they were in a treehouse. Along with the photos was a diary, with yellowed pages and almost illegible handwriting. Pedro began to read aloud. The note spoke of two children who spent their days in the treehouse, but who began to hear whispers coming from the woods. The diary ended abruptly, with a last sentence that chilled the blood of the three. "We can't get out. He's down here with us." Before they could react, a sound echoed through the space, a heavy dragging, as if something were moving in the darkness. Rafael pointed his flashlight, but couldn't identify anything. "Let's get out of here," Lucas whispered, his voice breaking. But the sound was getting closer. The darkness seemed to close in around them, swallowing the light from their flashlights. In the midst of their panic, they ran back to the ladder and hurriedly climbed it, feeling a presence behind them. When they finally left the treehouse, the woods were different. The wind, previously non-existent, was now blowing hard, making the trees creak. They ran like never before, each sound behind them increasing the feeling that they were being chased. They arrived at Lucas's house breathless, closing the door behind them. Neither of them could speak for a long time. Rafael finally broke the silence, pointing to the camera that Lucas was still holding. "We need to see what we recorded." The group revisits the recordings in search of answers, but what they find in the images reveals something much more sinister than they could have imagined. The pieces begin to fit together, and the true danger is finally understood. Now, I have an invitation, or perhaps a challenge for you. Share this story with someone you know, someone who might be thinking about venturing into dark places. Warn them. Show them that there are hidden dangers where we least expect it. And if you've ever been through something similar, or if you have a story that makes you look over your shoulder when you enter a website, tell us in the comments. Who knows? Together we can shed light on the darkest corners of the internet. Or at least keep a safe distance. After all, sometimes the best choice is not to know.